And now it is time to move from Germany to UK and see what are the best practices there. For this, I would like to invite Tom Westgarth and Kirsty Trim to join me on a stage to discuss about responsible AI, developing responsible AI together with government. Tom Westgarth is an AI policy consultant at Oxford Insights, where he was worked to assess AI readiness for different countries around the world. And Kirsty Trim is the head of programs at Oxford Insights. So welcome, guys.
Firstly, thank you so much to the AI Boost team for organising this event. We're really delighted to take part with such a brilliant set of speakers. What we are going to be talking about today is our Responsible AI Index. So what I'm going to do to begin with is firstly just kind of set the context for why responsible AI we believe is an integral part of government strategy. And then Kirsty, my colleague, is going to explain a little bit more about the data, what we've been using to record the index, and the main stories that have come out of the index for this year's publication.
So before we move on, just a quick question before we go into the details, into the indexes. In your own words, can you simplify? So what is responsible AI?
Well, but we've actually got a definition of that here. I can go to it very quickly.
So then let's switch to your presentation for me not to jump right into the middle of it.
Yeah. Yes, so the World Economic Forum defines responsible AI as the practicing of designing, building, and deploying AI systems in a manner that empowers people and businesses and fairly impacts customers and society, which allows companies to engender trust and scale with confidence. So that's fundamentally what strikes at the heart of responsible AI. But if you don't mind, very quickly, I'll just kind of jump back, if that's okay,
Sure.
Just to speak around what we do at Oxford Insights and how that's informed our approach to developing this index. So at Oxford Insights, what we do is we combine new thinking on technology and leadership and the experience of getting stuff done in government. And we're really passionate about increasing the impact of public services with regards to that. And this kind of falls into three main buckets around strategy, kind of assigning specific policy problems and making sure that we can implement a practical plan to deal with those problems. Strategy is also extremely important to us so that we can kind of tailor approaches to different organizations and different governments' unique challenges and strengths, and leadership. And this is where the responsible AI bit really comes into its own. The fact that you don't get great public services without brilliant public leadership. And that's absolutely essential. So we have myself and Kirsty here and some of our clients that we've dealt with working on these sorts of problems, not just kind of government sector departments as well, the Foreign Office in the UK and the Government Digital Service, but we also have a presence in the global development landscape as well, in particular Latin America. And our indexes, which is what we're going to talk about, is really essential to this. And we think it showcases best practice in creating AI policy. So a couple of years ago, we kind of started developing an AI Readiness Index, which only looked at the OECD countries, and it was only a small amount of indicators. And over time, it's built up. Now we're at a point where we're analyzing over 172 different countries with over 30 different indicators, including different forms of regional analyses with regional experts. And in particular, last year we had a responsible AI sub-index, and this was seen as quite a novel contribution to the field. And as a result, we've decided to expand the number of countries involved, expand the number of indicators that we use to try and create a much more holistic approach to understanding responsible AI. So I want to kind of give a bit of context, give a case study example to demonstrate why we think that responsible AI is important. Now, some people familiar with questions of recidivism, which is reoffending, may be familiar with this case. There was a kind of algorithmic tool just called Compass, which was designed to assess a criminal defendant's likelihood of reoffending. And there was a big study a few years ago by ProPublica, which analyzed 10,000 criminal defendants in Florida. And it was supposed to predict or compare the predicted recidivism rates, the predicted likelihood of reoffending, with the actual rate that occurred over a 2-year period. And the study found a couple of big problems with this tool. Firstly, a question of accuracy. So, for predictions of violent recidivism, violent reoffending, the tool was only correct in its predictions 20% of the time. But then there was a question of the disproportionality of the accuracy. Who was it that the tool was more accurate for as opposed to less accurate for? And the study found that Black defendants who did not reoffend over a 2-year period were nearly twice as likely to be misclassified or given a higher risk compared to their white counterparts. And even when you control for things such as age and prior crimes and gender, Black defendants were 45% more likely to be assigned high risk scores than white defendants. So this is a real world example of when an absence of thinking around questions of responsible AI actually plays out, actually has a material impact on the lives of people on an everyday basis. This isn't something that's far away or going to happen. It's here now. And as a result, we would like to think partially as responsible AI as a public policy tool. There's this definition that we gave before. And we can all recognize here that technology is this social innovation, right? It's something that it's not picked from the sky or growing from the ground. It's something that's created by human beings. And that's absolutely essential. And people come with it with their different approaches, their different experiences, their different backgrounds, their different thoughts and biases. And that can play out in the way that they design the technology, in the kind of data that's used, the kind of data that's not used. And that's absolutely essential. And not only is kind of AI a social innovation, it's a transformational social innovation. And the history of technology, the history of science shows that with these big disruptive insertions into the economic and political and social landscape, there's often massive benefits reaped, but there's also disproportionate harm caused elsewhere. And the distribution of benefits and harms will be unequal. And we think that responsible AI framings can help to address and mitigate these disproportionality problems. And it goes to the point that Daniel made so eloquently in the previous presentation, that actually trust is essential for uptake of these technologies within public sectors. And as a result, if the landscape looks like that there are all these problems around responsible AI, we believe that trust can actually be a competitive advantage, both for government, but also for businesses around the world as well. And I'm just going to pass on to Kirsty now, who's going to talk a little bit more about what the index, the responsible AI sub-index, looks like.
Thanks very much, Tom. And thank you for hosting us here today. I share Tom's excitement at being here at this fantastic conference. So Tom's already described a little bit about our work to define AI readiness and our inclusion last year for the first time of a responsible AI sub-index, which allowed us for the first time to start to really understand in detail how some of the countries were approaching the challenge of being responsible in their deployment of AI. And in preparing this index, the exam question that we set ourselves was, how well positioned is a given government to advance the responsible use of AI? We wanted to build a tool by which governments, but also stakeholders in all realms of society, can judge their country's progress globally and regionally. And then from here, governments can start to build a sense of the idea of the steps they need to take to improve their position to deliver and sustain a responsible framework for AI in their country. So as Tom has mentioned, the first 2020 sub-index surveyed 34 countries. And this year, we wanted to build on that foundation by expanding the indicators, and that would allow us a greater depth of insight, but also to extend the number of countries involved in the study. So this year for 2021, we're in the final stages of producing a responsible AI sub-index involving 50 countries around the world this year. And I should acknowledge our sponsors here, IDRC, the International Development Research Centre, who've been integral to challenging us to do this piece of work. A quick acknowledgement to our hosts. Unfortunately, Lithuania is not currently part of the study, so we're not in a position to talk about your experiences here in Lithuania, but hopefully next year, when IDRC roll out the sub-index to a global study, including all countries for which data is available, then we can really get into the detail of many more countries' situations. So just moving on to the next slide. What we'll do here is talk a little bit about the methodology behind how we started to understand responsible AI and how it was being applied across the world. So what does our index measure and why does it do this? In devising our metric, we started with the OECD principles on AI, which many of you, I'm sure, will be familiar with. But if you're not familiar with these concepts, I very much commend you to go and look them up when you have a little bit of time. It's a really great piece of work. Very briefly, then, the OECD principles have 5 pillars. I'll recap them very briefly. So the first one is that AI should benefit the people and the planet. Then AI systems should be designed in a way that respects the rule of law, that respects human rights, democratic values, and diversity, and includes, and this is important, appropriate safeguards to challenge where those rules of law and human rights are not being respected. There should be transparency and responsible disclosure around AI systems to ensure that people understand the outcomes of the AI being applied and that they can challenge those outcomes. The system should function in a robust, secure, and safe way throughout their life cycles, so not just implemented well at the start and then left, and changes are not challenged and monitored. And then finally, the organizations and individuals developing, deploying, or operating those systems should be held accountable for their proper functioning. So someone can be challenged to make changes or to be held accountable for the impact of those AI systems. So from these very high-level principles, we looked at primary and secondary data sources that would give an indication of the maturity of the responsible AI framework in a given country. We drew from readily available online data and also tasked a team of local experts to fill in the gaps on national indicators that were less easily identifiable to the public. I'll move on to the next slide. I think it would be really interesting to show you what we found. Thanks, Tom. So I mentioned that the 2021 study looks at 50 countries, and I should caveat again that our findings are still provisional at this stage, as we're in the very final stages of quality checking our data sources prior to publication. But the indicative provisional results are shown here. What you can see is on the world map, the blue colours are used to identify those countries scoring highly, which indicates that responsible AI concepts and practices are more strongly embedded in the public infrastructure in those countries. And the orange colours indicate those concepts and practices are less well established in that particular region. The provisional top 10 you can see there on the right-hand side. For me, the more interesting question, and we can talk about this in a little more detail on the next slide, is what is the data actually telling us? What's going on under the bonnet here? Why are some countries performing well or less well? And what's happened in those countries between last year and this year to explain the changes perhaps in appearances on the relevant indices. Unfortunately, we don't have time to explore all of the provisional findings in detail today, but some of the broad conclusions that we've drawn, we can start to pick out here and discuss. So as you can see, very happily for a conference that looks at Northern and Eastern European partners, the Northern European, Eastern European countries score very well on our index. And you can see the Nordic countries in particular are global leaders in responsible use of AI, with Finland, Norway, Sweden, and Denmark taking 4 of the top 5 positions in the rankings. I think that's probably something that you as European citizens will recognise and understand here. The EU countries generally have excellent conditions for the advancement of responsible AI in line with the OECD principles. So we have legal protections, we have great respect for human rights, values, and diversity. And the dominance of the Nordic region in particular owes much to the introduction of local policies, for example, promoting AI research and implementation for public good. The only non-Western European country in the top 10 there you can see is Canada. Canada's a really interesting case when you contrast it particularly with the US, so North American countries scoring quite differently. The US is 22nd place on our index of 50, which might be slightly surprising. Canada's score owes a great deal to its recent enactment of more up-to-date, robust privacy laws and mandated algorithmic impact assessments for government departments. And in contrast, the US, while it's very obviously a technology thought leader and it tops our AI Readiness Index, so on a purely technological public sector score, it scores very highly. It's only 22nd in our Responsible AI Index, reflecting a relatively less mature policy environment to promote the responsible use of AI. And as Daniel said in his previous talk, it's about a less open public environment for challenging and understanding how AI is being used in the public sector. The middle of the index, which I haven't shared, with you, but you can see it's dominated by countries from the far east of Europe, from South America, and from Eastern Asia. Most of these countries have policies and legislation in place around data protection and AI ethics. However, generally, many of them have fewer mechanisms to hold governments to account, as well as a lack of individual AI-specific individual rights. And then towards the bottom of our index, you see countries from the Middle East, North Africa, and sub-Saharan African regions. So I'd point out here that low scores don't necessarily mean that countries are not taking initiatives to advance responsible AI, and many of them are. It's more indicative of a weaker foundation for advancing the responsible development of AI technologies, and a more detailed analysis of our findings will allow governments and stakeholders to determine where they can take steps to progress. And we should recognise too that for many of these regions, the economic imperative is to get the technology in place first, and the responsible layer on top of it is a luxury that they're perhaps not in a position to exploit. And then towards the bottom of the index, you can see that the global AI powerhouses of India, Russia, and China all scoring particularly low on our scale. And we think this can largely be attributed to compromised civil liberties and individual rights in those regions, with less open governments and a lack of robust national AI ethic frameworks. I'll hand back to Tom now.
Great, thank you so much for that, Kirsty. And ultimately, we want to use these results and future results to help make an impact. The discourse around responsible AI is building, and there's some really productive conversations around how we can advance these principles. And we want to be one player that helps to contribute towards those conversations. And as Kirsty says, we're really wanting to expand not only the number of countries that are involved, but we want to expand our understanding of the indicators and what responsible AI actually is. We're not pretending that we have the 100% clear-cut definition of responsible AI. And actually, one of the most interesting and challenging features of thinking about a global index is that responsible and ethical principles differ massively across different parts of the world, and trying to capture that in one kind of global set of indicators is really difficult. And so that's why we are really encouraging kind of governments and public policies experts from around the world to engage with us on this. We want to make sure that our results are as accurate as possible, whether that's through initiatives that perhaps we hadn't quite thought about, whether that's through indicators that could kind of add to the richness of the data that we already have, and ultimately have that conversation with experts on the ground, because ultimately that's incredibly important to us. But we also want to do this engagement because we want to help develop government AI policy as well. Fortunately, it's sometimes a shame that a lot of the people interested in this stuff are often siloed in a small part of government often, or you can fit them in a small room sometimes, and that's a little bit frustrating. So we want to try and kind of articulate things that matter to people in the public policy arena beyond people in the traditional technology sector. And we see responsible AI as a really integral way of being able to start that conversation in a way that affects the lives of people on a daily basis, in a way that can relate to people that we all know. But alongside the Responsible AI Index, we sort of mentioned before that we have our AI Readiness Index, and we're also wishing in the future to create what's known as an AI Deployment Index. And I'll show you a kind of graphic very quickly of what we think this might look like. So you have an AI Readiness Index that we've designed previously, which helps to work out what are the foundational pillars in place to ensure that governments can deploy AI within their public services properly. You also have on top of that an understanding of responsible use. Is that being deployed in a way that adheres to a certain set of ethical principles? So, and Kirsty's talked about those OECD principles already. And then we think on top of that, we also want to develop what's known as an AI Deployment Index to see, right, what are those outcomes? What does that actually look like in reality on the ground? And we think that together with the foundational elements of the Readiness Index, with the outcomes based of the Deployment Index, and on top of that, with this understanding of the ethical deployment of these technologies, we think that can provide a global state of AI, a much richer mosaic of the understanding of the way that AI is used in government. And we're going to continue to iterate these indices to produce the most robust frameworks possible. We're not pretending we have the clear-cut answer right away, but we've really, really engaged with kind of thought leaders and policymakers from around the world previously to make sure that we can refine this and iterate this. And if you're interested in working with us on exploring this work further, then we really implore you to get in touch, because there's plenty of smart people that are attending events like this, and it's a shame to not even be starting to have conversations with those sorts of people. And finally, before we close, this is what we think it kind of could look like across the board. We've got here what our AI Readiness Index, our Responsible Use Index, and our Implementation Index. And we can do analyses at both global, regional, and local levels. So I appreciate there's a lot here, but I think across both indices at a global level, it's this kind of question of ranking. And then we want to do regional analyses with these local experts to parse out the key stories that aren't always available in the data. We want to be able to illustrate things and to kind of give tractable examples that policy leaders from around the world can look at and say, we can replicate some elements of this. And that's where the regional aspects are really important, as well as the local ones as well, to have those kind of niche profiles that investigate the state of AI. And hopefully that will allow a lot more kind of comparison as well, because there's so much knowledge out there in the space. But there's sometimes a problem of actually sharing that information. And I mean, it kind of goes back to the questions of open data before, in a way, that were discussed in the previous talk. But it's about being able to try and create forums for these sorts of conversations so that we can learn. Ultimately, kind of AI, in my view, is going to be a global public good. And global public goods are only best realized when they have the contribution of people from around the world working on ensuring that it goes well for humanity. And with that, I want to thank AI Boost again for their time, and we welcome any questions that you may have.
Thank you, Kirsty and Tom, for your presentation, for this dialogue, and for introduction of how does the world look on responsible innovation and responsible AI. But by looking at your slides, I've got the question. So while the Nordic countries are so hard pushing the responsible agenda, working on building the foundation of it, it seems that AI superhouses like India, China are just looking away. So aren't we missing international and inter-regional dialogue somehow to combine the forces on this?
Yeah, I think that's a really good point. And one of the reasons why European countries score so well is because, of course, they are working as a bloc to iterate their legislation and their policies, and they're having a ready dialogue here across the region about what good practice looks like. And I think you're right to characterize global powerhouses drawing very well on their economic foundations, but having less of a mature relationship with other nations to talk about best practice implementation. And I think to less public space where the public can say we want accountability on these issues because they affect us and they matter to us.
Tom, do you have anything to add on top?
I mean, Kirsty, I think, nailed a lot of the main points there. And I guess this is why we go back to the point around making sure that we can consider not just responsible AI, but AI readiness and AI deployment. And when you bring those together, you'll be able to see that there'll be certain, whether it's levels of R&D investment and R&D spend or high levels of research, there'll be areas where you can look at and see those powerhouses are performing really well there. But on the responsible front, perhaps less so. So being able to have that nuanced understanding of it, we think is really important, because then you can start to say, right, with this kind of transformative general purpose technology, where can we learn from these different regions? And so that's why, there are plenty of institutions, I think, that are starting to build up these frameworks. The OECD AI Policy Observatory, for example, is a great example of this. And I think we need more institutions that are trying to kind of, flesh out the different aspects of the different policy agendas of these countries.
But what would be your advice for the governments and policymakers to move them closer to the center of AI readiness from the outskirts?
I think it's a really tough question. The first thing I would say is there are plenty of questions around accountability that are not addressed sometimes. So, our index, some of the indicator points we talk about are having algorithmic impact assessments, having the right to human review, the right to explanation. So France, for example, has a really good initiative where algorithms that are used in public services, the public have a right to know, why has that decision been made? And that's really important for trust and uptake, because otherwise a lot of people will see, oh, algorithms are scary and we don't want to deal with them, and they'll have all these biases. So I think that's really important, kind of treating the public as an adult in the conversation and explaining that. That's something that's really important, and I think missing from the conversation in some of those nations.
And when you look at the comparison of different countries, which department, institution are the most common of leading the digital AI agenda? As sometimes we hear and we know the saying that shared responsibility is no one's responsibility. Well, we need to make it, but who's going to be in charge of it and finally deliver? So maybe you have some good practices to share and to inspire other government officials to look at it as an example.
I'd say very quickly, don't know if Kirsty has something, but the OECD, I'll just repeat it again, AI Policy Observatory is really starting to build up a profile of all the different agendas. Are certain agendas being met? So I think that's a really good place to look at where an institutional framework is being built.
And I'd just briefly add to that. I know we're running over time, that the sharing of best practice is really fundamental here. So I would like to see a much richer dialogue between and amongst nations about what's working well for them, and particularly the economic impact of introducing a responsible AI agenda.
Great. So thank you very much for your presentation and answers to those questions today. We're time's up with this session, but I hope you stick around.